A 3-year-old boy in Louisiana named James Leininger began having nightmares so violent his parents had to hold him down. He screamed about a plane on fire. He screamed about a man named James who couldn't get out. He talked about a little plane that got shot and crashed in the water. He named the aircraft carrier he flew from. He described his co-pilot. He drew pictures of dogfights with a detail no 3-year-old should possess. His parents were Christians. They did not believe in reincarnation. They were terrified. When they investigated James's claims, they found a World War II fighter pilot named James Houston, Jr., who died exactly as their son described. Shot down over Iwo Jima, his plane catching fire, crashing into the ocean. Houston had flown from the USS Natoma Bay. His co-pilot was named Jack Larson. Both details came from the mouth of a child who could barely tie his shoes. So what is happening when children say things like this? What does the science actually say? And why does this keep happening? Across cultures, across continents, across centuries, in ways that are almost impossible to explain away. This is what we know. The research into children who claim to remember past lives is not fringe pseudoscience conducted in someone's basement. It began in 1967 at the University of Virginia, when a psychiatrist named Ian Stevenson started formally documenting these cases with the same methodological rigor he would apply to any clinical study. Over the next 4 decades, Stevenson and his team collected over 2,500 cases from around the world. His successor, Jim Tucker, has continued that work and published findings in peer-reviewed journals, including the Journal of Scientific Exploration and Explore. What they found follows a remarkably consistent pattern. The children are almost always between 2 and 5 years old when the memories begin. They speak about a previous life spontaneously, not under hypnosis, not after being asked leading questions, not after watching something on television. They often describe how they died, and the deaths are disproportionately violent: drowning, car crashes, murder, war, surgical accidents. They sometimes refer to the previous personality by name. They show emotions, grief, longing, fear, that directly match the life they describe. And then, typically between the ages of 5 and 7, the memories fade. The child stops talking about it. They move on. In roughly 70% of cases where researchers were able to identify a corresponding deceased person, the child's statements match that person's life with a level of accuracy that exceeds chance by a margin that is very difficult to dismiss. Now, before we go any further, let's be honest about what the skeptics say. The most obvious explanation is confirmation bias. Parents hear their children say unusual things. Children say unusual things constantly, and they selectively remember and amplify the ones that seem to fit a pattern after the fact. They fill in gaps. They unconsciously steer the child toward a match. Memory is reconstructive, not reproductive. We remember what we expect to remember. This is a serious objection. And researchers like Tucker have taken it seriously, which is why the strongest cases in the database are the ones where the child's statements were written down before any investigation began, before anyone identified the potential previous personality, before any opportunity for contamination. In those cases, the verification rates are still striking. A second skeptical explanation is cryptomnesia. The child absorbed information about the deceased person from overheard conversations, television, family stories, or other environmental sources, and is confabulating a memory from those fragments without realizing it. This is plausible in cases where the previous personality was a family member or local celebrity. It is much less plausible in cases where the child described a person in another country, from a community the child has never been exposed to, using a language the child's family does not speak, And this is where the cases get genuinely difficult to explain. Tucker documented a case in Sri Lanka where a young girl described a previous life in a specific village she had never visited, named streets, described the layout of a house, identified neighbors, and described how she died in a bus accident. When researchers took her to the village, she navigated it correctly, identified family members of the deceased person she had never met, and pointed to changes in the house since the time of the death. The girl's family had no known connection to that village. In another case from India, a boy named Titu Singh began at age 2 insisting he was the owner of a radio shop in a nearby town called Agra. He named his wife. He named his children. He described being shot in the head while closing his shop at night. He described objects inside the shop. When researchers investigated, they found a man named Suresh Verma who had been shot and killed outside his radio shop in Agra. His wife confirmed details Titu had described that were not publicly known. His children, now teenagers, recognized something in the little boy that they couldn't explain. What do you do with information like that? Researchers have proposed several frameworks for understanding these cases, none of which requires you to accept a metaphysical conclusion if you don't want to. The first framework is what Tucker calls a consciousness-based model. In his 2013 book, Return to Life, Tucker argues that consciousness may not be entirely produced by the brain, that it may in some sense persist beyond physical death and in rare cases become associated with a new developing brain. This is not a supernatural claim in Tucker's framing. It is a hypothesis about the nature of consciousness that is at least consistent with certain interpretations of quantum mechanics, though that connection is contested, and Tucker himself is careful not to overstate it. The second framework is a genetic or epigenetic explanation. Could trauma experienced by a previous generation leave such a profound mark on the DNA that it manifests in a descendant as memory-like experiences? Research on transgenerational epigenetic inheritance, the idea that life experiences can alter gene expression in ways that are passed to offspring, is real and growing. Studies in mice have shown that fear responses to specific stimuli can be inherited across generations. Whether this mechanism could account for the specificity of what some children describe remains deeply unclear. The third framework is the most conservative. These are psychologically generated experiences that reflect normal childhood fantasy, selectively filtered through parental attention and researcher expectation, in a culture that provides the narrative of reincarnation as a template. This explains the higher prevalence of cases in countries like India, Sri Lanka, and Thailand, where reincarnation is a culturally accepted belief, though it does not easily explain why the pattern holds even in Western secular families like the Leiningers, who actively resisted the reincarnation interpretation. There is one more element of these cases that deserves attention: the birthmarks. In approximately 35% of cases in Stevenson's database, the child carries a birthmark or birth defect that corresponds to a wound on the body of the person they claim to have been. A child who describes dying from a gunshot wound to the chest has a birthmark on the chest. A child who describes a sword wound to the neck has a scar-like marking at the neck. Stevenson documented over 200 such cases, and in 49 of them obtained medical records, autopsy reports, hospital records, confirming that the wounds on the deceased matched the marks on the child's body. The medical establishment has no explanation for this. Dermatologists can explain port wine stains, café au lait spots, and congenital melanocytic nevi. They cannot explain why a child's birthmark would correspond with statistically improbable precision to the wound pattern of a specific deceased individual. This does not prove reincarnation. What it proves is that something is happening that our current scientific frameworks do not adequately account for. Let's come back to James Leininger for a moment. When James was 5, His parents took him to a memorial service for veterans of the USS Natoma Bay. At the service, James met Jack Larson, the co-pilot he had named as a toddler. Jack Larson was in his 80s. He had never met the Leininger family. He confirmed the details James had described. He said James knew things about James Houston Jr. that only someone who had been there could know. James is now in his 20s. He doesn't remember any of it. The memories faded, as they almost always do, around age 7. He is by all accounts a normal young man with no particular interest in reincarnation or the afterlife, which is perhaps the most striking thing of all. These children do not hold on to their memories. They do not build an identity around them. They report what they know. They feel what they feel. And then they let go. Whatever door opens between the ages of 2 and 5 seems to close again, quietly, without fanfare, as the child grows into the world they were born into. What remains is the record, the statements written down before the investigation, the birthmarks that match the wounds, the strangers who recognize something in a child's eyes, the details no one can explain. Science does not yet know what to do with these cases. That is not the same as saying they are not real. The question of whether children can remember past lives remains one of the most methodologically rigorous and stubbornly unresolved puzzles in the study of human consciousness. And the researchers who have dedicated their careers to it are not mystics or charlatans. They are psychiatrists, physicians, and cognitive scientists who looked at the evidence and concluded that dismissing it without serious investigation would itself be a failure of scientific thinking. Whatever the explanation turns out to be, one thing is certain. These children are trying to tell us something. And for most of human history, we have not been listening carefully enough.